handout of the prayers. We will start today with the sign of the cross and with the Our Father. If you know it, feel free to join in. If you don't know it, feel free to try to muddle through it. God still understands even muddled Latin. So, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater noster, qui es in caelis, sanctificetur nomen tuum. Adveniat regnum tuum. Fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So we are starting out, and this is a bit of an interesting sort of change of pace for some of our programming here in the parish. One, the fact that this table is full. I get between 5 and a dozen people at most of my book discussions and other educational series, so to have this many people is quite nice. And we've had a couple of people who said they wanted to join us either in real time or delayed by YouTube, and so we are streaming these. So if your Latin frustrates you, if learning Latin frustrates you, then remember that your frustrations are being recorded, and so keep it PG so we don't get our channel removed. Although to be quite honest, Mass stays around PG, and we still got our channel taken down about a year ago because of, I don't know, copyright something or other. Anyway, so a little bit about first why we're doing this. Partly because I kind of threw out the idea and people said that sounds like a good idea, and then we put out. We just kind of asked what kind of interest was there. Obviously, there's a great deal of interest. And there are actually quite a number of people too who expressed interest who aren't even here right now. So that's knowing that we had that kind of interest. I was like, well, if there is an interest, then clearly we'll do it. But also kind of more objectively, why are we doing this? There is a perception that the Second Vatican Council came in and said that we as Catholics could not worship in Latin anymore. Latin had been the liturgical language of the Roman Church from the middle of the patristic period, or starting to become that in the patristic period. In the first, say, 4 centuries of Christianity, the Mass was all in Greek because that was what everybody spoke. But then over time, Latin came to displace it in the West, and it was our language of worship, broadly used until the early 1970s. And there's this idea that Vatican II said, don't do Latin anymore. I actually had somebody say that to me not too long ago. The fact is that's actually not true. If you read the document on the liturgy from the Second Vatican Council, it says that the Latin language is the mother tongue of the Roman Church. If you read, and on the flyer that we put out advertising this class, there's a lengthy quote on there. There's 2 quotes actually from Pope John the 23rd, the Pope who convoked the Second Vatican Council, from a document he wrote called Veterum Sapientia, which means ancient wisdom. And it is a document about why Latin is so important to the life of the church. And actually, there's a paragraph in there, too, about why ancient Greek is so important to the life of the church. The idea is that to thoroughly sort of understand our faith as it's been transmitted, there's a need to study the ancient languages. And Latin, given that it is such a long part of our lineage, is very important. So the idea that Vatican II came along and just deleted the Latin language from the life of the church is just not true. In practice, that's what happened after that. But the council actually called for that to continue to remain our language of worship, and John himself continued to call for that to be a part of our culture, that we have a culture that is formed around it. Language shapes culture and vice versa. And the nice thing about it is that the words that we might use now, if we were to go upstairs and if I had the missal for the new rite of the Mass in Latin, which I don't because they're about $500 and I just haven't budgeted for that at this point. But if we were to go upstairs and have Mass totally in Latin, the words as we use them now mean the same thing that they did 500 years ago or 800 years ago. That because that became a liturgical usage and stayed that way even after Latin was no longer being spoken, people will say it's a dead language, sort of even pejoratively. There's a benefit to learning a dead language, and that's that the meanings stay relatively static, to the point that the Vatican has a Latin office, and every year they have to come out with a new list of terms they had to make up to cover realities that have been invented since the Latin language quit being spoken. And sometimes they're almost ridiculous because there isn't a word in Latin, for instance, for fax machine. So it's like a light picture transmission device is how it gets rendered. And so every year they come out with a new list of about a dozen to sometimes even more than that concepts that have emerged in recent times that have to be covered, because we still publish church documents in these things, and we still have to transmit what's being said kind of currently. And so there's a benefit to learning it kind of more broadly as Catholics. Again, it's just part of our culture. And it's how our faith was transmitted and proclaimed for a very long time. It was the language of theology up until really very, very recent times. The Code of Canon Law from 1983. So this is not some ancient thing, but the Code of Canon Law actually says that all clerics, once they finish seminary, are to be expert in Latin. The word idoneos means that you are really, really good at it. Basically to the point of fluency. In practice, that's not necessarily the case. And I'll tell you, when I was in seminary, Latin was actually optional. We took it in the first couple of years if you wanted to. If you were doing certain degree programs, you had to take it. I was doing scripture, so I had to have 2 ancient languages, and I could have actually done Greek and Hebrew and skipped right over Latin. But Latin is pretty useful, pretty accessible in some way. And if you already know a Romance language like Spanish or French, then it's actually even easier to learn Latin. I found that when I would say Mass privately in Latin when I was assigned in Monroe, where 85% of our parishioners are Hispanic, and I was speaking Spanish constantly, my Latin actually got better. Like I could say Mass a little quicker because it was more fluid because I was speaking Spanish all the time. So if you already have some familiarity, and that kind of leads me to a more practical point here, that will make it very easy. Watch for what's familiar. That's why I'm going to bombard you with things that are familiar. The prayers that I've handed you are ones that you probably are already familiar with. The Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Glory Be, the Sign of the Cross, and I put the Salve Regina in there, and then I also put on the back the prayers of the Divine Mercy Chaplet, which is a nice way to practice your pronunciation because the Divine Mercy Chaplet is repetitive, and you just say the words over and over and over again. And as we go through this, I might make some recordings like of how to say the prayers, and maybe even post a video of the chaplet so you can kind of pray along, and that way you can pick up the pronunciation. Which again, and so going back to why we're doing this, in addition to sort of the broader kind of objective cultural point, it's a good formational thing for us as individuals because it affects how you think. And that's anytime you learn another language and kind of have to learn to put things in different terms, because things don't always translate one-to-one. If things translated one-to-one, there wouldn't be different languages. That things don't always translate one-to-one. Learning a language is not a secret code. It's about adopting a way of thinking. And Latin is a different way of thinking than we're accustomed to because of how the language is inflected. That English is a very much eroded language that doesn't have a lot of the it has almost no grammatical cases, and it has very little verb conjugation. And so Latin helps us to kind of consider things a little bit differently. That's really going to, as we go, that will probably freak out some people in that there is no word order in Latin because how you put the endings on the words tells what the word does in a sentence. So you can put things in almost any order you want to, and it will still make sense. A friend of mine told me when he was at World Youth Day in Germany many years ago, he saw this church, and he knew a little bit of Latin because he had gone to a Catholic high school and he studied it. He saw this church that had a dome with like this great Latin inscription around it. So he's walking around the church and kind of trying to read what it says. And he said he got to the end and there were 7 verbs at the end. And he's like, yeah, never mind. But I promise you, we'll start out, we'll start slow, we'll work slowly, and we will, try to keep things at a reasonable pace here because, I want people to be able to absorb what they can. All right. So again, just a kind of a note. Remember to look for things that are familiar. Look for cognates. That might be helpful, like as you kind of look over things day to day, because we're only doing this once a week. So in the meantime, try to bolster what you've learned. And like I say, I'll give you resources and things for that. But go through the prayers and maybe highlight words that look like a word, like find words you don't know, but that look like words you already do know. For instance, in the Our Father, we prayed Adveniat Regnum Tuum. That Adveniat sounds suspiciously like Advent because it is the same word. And Adveniat Regnum Tuum, we know from praying the Our Father in English that is, thy kingdom come. So adveniat is going to have something to do with coming. And it comes from the word venire, which means to come. And then adveniat is going to be an intensifier of that. So we'll go over things like that. So I'd say go through there and look for words that maybe you don't know, but that sound like things you do know. And that helps to familiarize not only with what do the words mean, but how are words going to be structured. And it's really nice that that if you speak English or Spanish, you already speak a language that's just infused with tons of Latin. Spanish basically is Latin that got parked out on the Iberian Peninsula and left in the sun for a couple of centuries, and sounds a little different now. But at the same time, to someone who speaks, say, Spanish or French, a lot of this is going to be already very familiar to you, and particularly some of the structural things. So the first thing we'll do, we'll go over the book. This book, Latin Grammar for the Reading of the Missal and the Breviary, by Scanlon and Scanlon. I'm guessing they were married. Given the fact they both lived in Milwaukee, they have the same last name, and they were both Latin teachers. That must have been a fun dinner conversation every night. This book has been published for quite a long time. You can tell kind of by the way the typesetting and everything looks. It's kind of an old book. This book was an introductory text used by seminarians to help them learn enough Latin to pray the divine office, what we now call the Liturgy of the Hours, and to comprehend the Missal. So basically, if you work your way all the way through this book, then you can pray your breviary and go to Mass totally in Latin and know exactly what's being said. To the point that I keep this book by my chair sometimes when I'm praying the breviary, because the glossary in the back is very helpful at telling me words that I'm not 100% familiar with. Because as I said, I've never taught Latin before, and I've taken a lot of Latin, but it's also been several years that I haven't had a Latin class since I was in my second year of seminary. So that's been a little while. Basically, it's been about 10 years, but I'm familiar with it because I work with it all the time. I say Mass in it at least once a week. I usually say my daily prayers in Latin. I read the Psalms in Latin, and I'm trying to think. I would say I would put on the Latin subtitles for watching movies, but those don't exist. So there just are not enough movies in Latin. There's only one movie I know of that is in Latin, and that's The Passion of the Christ. And actually, that's a massive anachronism in that movie, because the soldiers of the Syrian Legion didn't speak Latin because they weren't from Italy. They spoke Greek like everybody else did in the Middle East at the time, because Greek was sort of the international language. Greek was the English of the ancient Near East. Everybody spoke Greek as sort of a trade language. That's why the Gospels were written in Greek. That's why Jesus and the apostles probably spoke Greek as they were going out and about. So the soldiers are speaking Latin in the Passion of the Christ for reasons that I'll actually point to here in a moment. We're going to start in the kind of the introductory part here. We'll go over the pronunciation today. Also, I found this little card that has pronunciation on it. I'm going to order one of those for everybody because we discovered that they're only 89 cents a piece, and they're very handy. A handy little laminated card to assist you in your pronunciation. We'll go ahead and look at the first unit, just kind of how it's set up. It begins with some phrases that come from liturgical use, because again, this book is about orienting you to liturgical Latin. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa is a great way to start out. We start by confessing our sins. Then there's some vocabulary. And as we go through we'll go through the first chapter probably next week. Or I may go ahead and set that up actually, because that would make more sense. You'll see why there is an extra ending after each word. It then gives a bit of an explanation as to the grammatical things being talked about. And then after all that, it gives you kind of an example of everything. And then it gives you some exercises. And what we'll generally do, we'll start out the first few weeks. I'll go over just all of the exercises. And then you can go back and kind of practice them during the week. And then as we get deeper into this and later on into the book, I'll do the first set of exercises in class, and then you can go home and do the second set of exercises. So I like giving people homework. I don't like grading homework, though. So we're not going to grade homework. There are no grades. You can't fail this class. We're doing instead of school consequences, which ultimately don't matter, because who cares that you got like a C- in trigonometry in the 11th grade? But there'll be real world consequences if you don't do your homework. You just don't learn Latin. So remember that you paid nothing for this class, so you get your money's worth if you. By doing free programming, I guarantee you'll always get your money's worth. So, all right. So let's start looking at the pronunciation. Pronunciation tends to be one of the things, and I actually, for a long time, I didn't actually understand this until I went to Spanish immersion, because I have an ear for learning pronunciation. And so for a long time, I spoke no Spanish, but I could pronounce it convincingly enough when I would read it that people thought I spoke Spanish. And so my very first parish assignment as a seminarian, the year before I was here, I would lecture at Mass. And actually the very first weekend I was there, the pastor didn't speak any Spanish, so he'd have somebody translate his homily and then have one of the readers read the translation of it out loud. And he told me too, he said that whoever he had to get a new translator at one point, because his homily would be 1,200 words or so in English, and good 12, 15-minute homily. And then he noticed that at Spanish Mass the homilies were so much longer that suddenly they were like half an hour long, and he couldn't figure out why. And they said whoever was translating them was adding in more paragraphs, like adding in stuff that they wanted to be taught, that like their little apostolate was going over, whatever. And somebody came out of the office one day and left him a sheet of homily suggestions, and he immediately deposited it in file 13. So, but I stood up and read this, and appropriately it was Pentecost Sunday, when the multitude of languages is spoken by the apostles. But a couple weeks later, I was sitting there before Mass, and this girl sits down and is trying to ask me if I can help with something. And I have no idea what she's saying because I didn't speak Spanish. And I stopped her and just said, she's talking 1,000 miles an hour. And I stopped her and said, I don't speak Spanish. She said, well, I don't speak English. I said, well, then we've got a problem. But I could pick up pronunciation. And it wasn't until I went to Spanish immersion and found out that pronunciation is one of the last things that most people pick up. So I learned languages backwards, apparently. But we're going to start with pronunciation because I find if you know how to pronounce it, it's easier than to practice it to get that muscle memory in there. So for the most part, so the beautiful thing about Latin as opposed to English, and the beautiful thing about, like, say, the Romance languages, most other languages, in fact, almost every language but English, and French, which is baffling in its pronunciation. And then once you've mastered that thing, you have to figure out pronoun usage, and that's even worse. Because none of them make any intuitive sense according to any other language. But the nice thing about Latin is that everything is always pronounced exactly the same way all the time. It's not like that wonderful thing in English, that great English institution of this thing that can be pronounced in 9 different valid ways. We're not going to have that in Latin. Everything is always pronounced exactly the same. So that's easy. The vowels, a, e, O, U. That's all it's ever going to be. All the vowels are always going to be pronounced the same way. If you speak Spanish, you have already mastered this. If you speak Japanese, you have already mastered this. Yeah. If you speak almost any other language but English and French, you have already mastered this. Occasionally, we're going to run into some diphthongs in Latin, which sounds bad and might get the video demonetized. You're going to have an AE. Sometimes you'll see it written as A with like an E kind of mutated onto it like that. You're going to have an OE, which also will look nearly identical because I didn't draw them sharply enough to differentiate them. It's easier in capital letters. That looks like something out of science fiction. Yeah. And then AU is never smashed together. We are learning ecclesiastical pronunciation. Ecclesiastical pronunciation is not how the ancient Romans spoke Latin. We are learning the pronunciation that was used kind of in Italy from the, I want to say about around the time of Jesus, probably a little after. I'm not entirely sure. It's not entirely important, but this is how Latin has always been spoken in the church. If you are familiar with Italian, this will all be quite familiar to you because this is basically Italianate Latin, and this is where Italian gets its pronunciation from. The story of kind of modern language is that, again, Latin just sort of spread all over the Roman Empire and then got left in various places and got mixed in with local things. And in some places like Spain and Portugal, it didn't look that different from Latin. Those are still fairly they're considered to be conservative languages in that they retained a lot of their Latin roots. Italian is the same way. The verbs in Italian are conjugated almost exactly how they are in Latin. Then you have some like French, where it got mixed with insanity, and the pronunciation is like the chapter on how to pronounce French in that book just says it's impossible. Don't bother. They're all going to make fun of you anyway. So these things are going to actually have a pronunciation that's particular to them in ecclesiastical Latin. The AE is pronounced A. A. Let's see if we have an example from our prayers this morning here. A. It's a long A sound, what we call a long A sound. Yeah, the word chelo. That's going to be that A, chelo. Sounds like J-Lo. What's she doing here? The OE is going to have the same pronunciation, and actually in some texts, the two will be used interchangeably. So we might also run into chelo, and it's the same. It's pronounced the same. One of the things you'll run into in studying ancient languages is that there wasn't really such a thing as standardized spelling rules until relatively late in the game. This is even true of English. This is why when you go driving through the countryside and you see the churches that have the sign that say they only use the 1611 King James Bible, I don't believe them, because they wouldn't be able to read the 1611 King James Bible, because to a modern speaker it's completely incomprehensible, and I know because I have a copy of it on my shelf. And in the introduction to it, it's a facsimile. I don't have a real one. If I had a real one, then this church would be the Taj Mahal. I mean, I like how that's not a real the painting of St. Francis upstairs is not a real. It's not Michelangelo. It's anyway. But the book even talks about how there wasn't really standardized spell. You don't really get standardized spelling in languages until about the late 18th century, and even then, there's still a lot of variation. That you don't start to see, say, governmental institutes promoting languages according to a certain standardized form. And even then, like Spanish, every Spanish-speaking country has a Institute of the Spanish Language, and they all disagree with each other. So again, you'll see these two sounds used interchangeably. They're pronounced exactly the same way. So anytime you see an AE together, an OE together, or an A and an E and an O and an E glued together, it's pronounced A. Chelo, cheli. The other one is AU. That's going to be ow, which makes sense that if this is ah and this is oo and we put them together, you get ow. So morning prayer is lauds, laudis. Am I losing my stream here? No, it's just the screen is a little dark. All right. Well, that's the easy part. Now let's descend into madness. We're talking about the consonants now. The letter C has two pronunciations. But it's not, because there are two kinds of vowels. There are long vowels and short vowels. CA is ka. CO is ko. And CU is ku. So it's a K sound when it's in front of a, o, and u. And you can tell that's when it's going to be because you open your mouth wider to say those vowels. A, o, u. Those are pronounced in the front of your mouth, and then you open your mouth wider. Those are the long vowels. In front of short vowels, this is where it gets weird. This is where it gets Italian. It's a ch sound in ecclesiastical Latin. So che and chi. Apparently it's Chinese. Also in front of our diphthongs, che and che. Ka, ko, ku, che, chi. If you speak Spanish, this is how G is also done. You have ga, go, gu, ge, gi, or he, he. And the reason is that in front of a long vowel, the consonant is a hard sound, and in front of a short vowel, it's a soft sound. So ka, ko, ku, che, chi. Any questions? Sometimes I know what I'm talking about, but I'm not sure I'm conveying it in the way that everybody else knows what I'm talking about. So again, sometimes I know what I'm talking about. That's your mileage may vary. Okay, clear as mud. Got it. The next time we see the letter C is going to be in front of the letter H. That's also going to be kind of a hard K sound, as in the word ache. Christus is going to be where we're most familiar with that. You will sometimes hear that one devocalized a little bit because it's related to the Greek that looks like an X, but it's actually a ch. You'll hear it pronounced like back in your throat, like your German. But we'll just say Christus. You could go Christus, but you don't really have to. Better to do it that way and not spit all over everything. You know, we don't spit on things in the post-COVID world. All right. I'm going to have a bit of coffee while we. Now, the really cool thing is that I don't have to erase the board to explain the next part because I'm just turning all these C's into G's because that's the next weird bit of pronunciation. You can assume that if I'm not covering a letter and how it's pronounced that you already know how to do it because it's not pronounced any differently than how it would be in, say, English or potentially Spanish. But all right, so G, I'm going to make these capital G's because that's easier. This one's fun. Oh, I've got to reverse that. Never mind. Nope, that's right. Okay. So same deal. Ga, go, gu, hard sound in front of a long vowel. J, G. So examples of this would be, or in front of another consonant, it's going to be a hard sound. So like gratias, when we say Deo gratias, thanks be to God, or Gloria. Genesis, right. Genesis, gensium, gens, agit, agere, what? Yeah, gementes et flentes, yes. Weeping and mourning in this valley of tears, also known as my Latin class. I'm going to change it. Originally, I made it the title very exuberant on the video and on the flyer. It's Discamus Linguam Latinam. Let's learn the Latin language. But I may just change it to gementes et flentes. We'll see how it goes. Maybe 4 weeks from now, we have a different perspective on things. I don't know of any words that actually put an AE after a G, but that would also be that soft J. So J, J. The GN is where it's going to get fun. If you speak Spanish, you've already mastered this because it is the same thing as an N with a tilde over it. Agnus Dei, not Agnus Dei. I was in a parish one time where they had a window of the Lamb of God that they had misspelled, and it said Agnus Dei. That's not correct. Yeah. We also had a cantor at one of the parishes where I was assigned who would sing it like that, and he had a real raspy voice in it. So every Sunday I would sit there and just like jolt in my seat. Agnus Dei. And it's like, no, Agnus Dei. It's a soft sound. You remember that because Agnus Dei means Lamb of God, and lambs are soft. So it's a soft sound. It's pleasant. And in fact, when we translate it into Spanish, it's a soft sound. It has that little mark to it. You're doing your hand like that when you say the word soft. Agnus, ignis, fire. Yeah. All right. Are we good? I can erase this without completely destroying your memory and your hopes and dreams. All right. The next one is actually not a consonant, it's a vowel, but it's being used as a consonant. So whenever you see an I at the beginning of a word, like, Jesus, which should be familiar to us, it's going to be pronounced kind of like a Y in English, which if you actually think about it, the Y in English is not really a distinct sound from a long I like that. Think about how you say yes. Slow it down. Yes. You make an E and then an E, and then you put them together and you get yeah. But that's why that sound doesn't really exist in too many other languages, because why would you have two different letters that express the same thing? You will sometimes see medieval texts that will say that. with a J, but it's still pronounced like it's an I. Jesus. That's mostly certain medieval texts, and again, there was no standardized orthography, so it would be pronounced the same way. Every time you see an S, this is never going to be pronounced Jesus, where this S is kind of a Z sound. That doesn't happen for the S in Latin. It's always going to be just an S by itself is always going to be an aspirated sound. So Jesus, Jesus. Again, just like in Spanish, where Spanish is really easy to learn how to pronounce because the letters are always all pronounced the same. That it's not. There aren't it's not like English where depending on whether or not it's Tuesday, you might pronounce a letter differently. So Jesus, the S is always going to be the same thing, except for, and here's where it gets weird, got another long, short one. When we have an SC, we're in the wrong state. Before an A, O, or U, or a consonant, that's going to be like a K sound. Again, just like our C is a hard C then. So ska, sko, sku. Like scutum means shield. Or if you have this Greek word here that is what we use to mean Easter, Pascha, because that H isn't really pronounced. So the SC in front of a long vowel is just like C is ka, ko, ku, SC is ska, sko, sku. Or in front of another consonant, like this one, good word to learn, sklopetum, means gun. Fere sklopetum tuum semper. Always carry your gun. In front of an E or an I, this becomes sh. So just like C becomes ch, SC becomes sh. So ascendere, to ascend. It's ascendere. And then the I, like in the word for knowledge, scientia. Not sciencia, not scientia, scientia. Scientia. Feminism. All right. Are we good?
Question.
Yes.
Are the I and the J interchangeable?
Yes.
So at any given time,
Usually, you're only going to see the J as an initial letter,
okay.
but again, it's an I, and you could pull the same text out of two different sources and have a J on one of them and an I on the other, and again, it's pronounced the same. And like I said, they're virtually used interchangeably as initial letters. That still looks like something out of science fiction. It's like a kind of currency in a Philip K. Dick novel or something. All right, our next consonant sound. This one's really easy. TH is always going to be pronounced as a hard T. TH like Thomas. It's always going to be T. Never Th. That sound doesn't exist in Latin. It exists in Greek with the letter theta, but theta does not equal Latin TH. I'm going to flip back over here because I've already used this one. Yes.
How do you pronounce that again? I'm sorry.
The TH. It's always a hard T.
T, okay.
Yeah. It's never an aspirated TH sound like in English. Spanish has it, but only in Spain. And then it's how you pronounce a soft C. which is ridiculous, yeah. 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 Yeah, English has that. French doesn't, though. So like the word discotheque in French, which passed into English and then gave us the word disco, it's discotheque. It's not thec. Does that make it sound even weirder? Discotheque. If you have a TI followed by a vowel, This is where it gets tricky. If you have a TI sound followed by another vowel, so here we have an A, and it's preceded by any letter except S, T, or X, and I'll illustrate, then it's going to be a kind of a TS sound. So Sciencia. That's where we get that ending in English, ence. Sciencia. So pretend that there's an S there, but there isn't. Sciencia. With the other things that a TI could have in front of it, if it has an S in front of it, then it's pronounced just like it would be, say, in English. Sti. I'm trying to think of a word like that.
Studium.
It's not STI, though.
STI.
Yeah, I want an STI word.
Stupid.
If it's got another T in it, then it's just T. If it's got an X, T, I, then like extinguish, it would just be pronounced, the letters are pronounced distinctly. It's only when it's a TI followed by a vowel and that doesn't have S, T, or E in it. So basically the easier way to remember it, the simplest way to remember it is these are the words that are going to have that ence ending when they translate. Sciencia. Consciencia, not conscience. That's where we get in English that this T-I-O-N is pronounced shun, is that TS sound in Latin. This is one of those things that it's like the rule is a little bit complicated because we have a rule and then we have a condition and then we have three exceptions. It's one of those things that I wouldn't worry too much about it because it'll just become intuitive the more you I don't sit like when I read my breviary in the morning and think, all right, here's a TI sound. Now which one is it? You get an ear for it, and eventually it just kind of, when it comes up one way, you'll say it the one way. It comes up another way, you say it the other way, because that's how you learned your language. If when you were learning English, you were taught how to pronounce things correctly, usually because you said something you heard somebody else say, but you made a mistake in how you said it, and then somebody corrected you, and you internalized that. So that's why the rules are important, but don't get too hung up on them because it'll become clear as you go. The last one is going to be X. When an X, we'll put it over here. When an X is followed by a vowel, begins with E, a word that begins in E, or is followed by a vowel, or an H or an S, which are softer sounds, then it's pronounced as we do in English, X. Like exaudire, which we say when we say the litany of the Sacred Heart on Fridays, when we say, Christ graciously hear us, Christe exaudi nos. So audi nos is hear us, exaudi nos is no, like really hear us. And there's a lot of words like that. That's actually why something that is flammable burns, and so does something that's inflammable. In English, that's a negation. In Latin, that's an intensifier. So inflammable doesn't mean not flammable, it means really flammable. Yeah.
The pronunciation, it says in here, is a GS.
Kinda, but I mean, we sort of erode that into X like we normally said. I mean, I get like I've never heard anybody pronounce it more as a G sound, and so yeah, it's
Kind of sounds like eggs.
yeah, egg Saudi. Yeah.
Egg salad.
Egg salad. Christe egg salad. Nos. Christ throw egg salad in us. So gross. I hate egg salad. It's so disgusting. It's a nasty thought. That's going to get the video demonetized. The other times. Okay, so this is giving us two different pronunciations, but yeah, it's funny that it splits like that because I've never actually heard that. Because basically, in the way I was taught Latin was in every case you actually pronounce it just like you do in English. Because it does say, okay, so I'm looking at that now. Yeah, so it says like exaudire, but I've never heard it pronounced like that. So I'm not saying the book is wrong. I'm just saying that I've never heard that before, and I don't know of anybody who pronounces it like that. So basically, when I say Domine exaudi oratione, man, God doesn't say, nope, I will not hear your prayers because you did not pronounce exaudire correctly. But basically, it's pronounced exactly like it is in English, because then you have other cases like pax multis diligentibus legem, and exclusare, to exclude, which means to, because if I'm remembering right, that means to like take something that's closed and unclose it or something. I guess that would be to more intensely close it at that point. Or no, it means to take out. Anyway. All right. So we'll go into kind of a point about the next time, but we're running close to noon, and the cleaning ladies will probably be here in a moment too. Oh, they're coming tomorrow? Okay, so I can keep talking. Unless there are objections to me continuing to talk about this. Are we ready to continue, or are our brains exploding? If we need a break, we can take a break. I kind of want to get into the next thing because it is something that's very different from, it's something that doesn't exist in, I know it doesn't exist in English, Spanish, or French. It exists in English, but not in any, and it exists in Spanish too, but it's not something intuitive to the speakers of most modern languages. That I think German still does this, and Russian does it, like the other Slavic languages, but it's not something terribly common in most languages that most of us are going to be familiar with. So we'll go into chapter 1 here, lesson 1. And just as an exercise, let's pronounce the vocabulary words. Aqua, anima. You see where the accent marks fall, that's to help with pronunciation. Terra, tuba, via, vita. That's another thing that's different between ecclesiastical and classical pronunciation. If you ever took classical Latin, the V is pronounced like a W, and it sounds ridiculous. I'll just come right out and say that on record. I will look into the camera and say that classical Latin sounds ridiculous. A good friend of mine in college put it that I have a really hard time believing that when Caesar conquered all the known world, he looked out over the battlefield and said, "Weni, weedy, winky." Veni, vidi, vinci sounds much nicer. I don't care if that's how he didn't say it. Yeah.
It's stronger.
Can get a sense of like Napoleon saying it the other way, but not Caesar. Yeah. Maria, Lucia. Yeah, that CH sound in there. Culpa, et, a, or ab. The difference would be that a would be before a consonant and ab would be before a vowel. And we do that sometimes. That's why in English there's between a and an when we pronounce when we use the definite article or an indefinite. That's an indefinite article, yeah. Or x, same deal. A is before a consonant, x is before a vowel, and those will also be appended to the beginnings of words. Sometimes x means out of, sometimes it's an intensifier. Usually it means out of or from. If you look in some old books that you bought used, you might find a book plate in the front that says ex libris, from the books of the person whose name is at the bottom. Cum, very important word, it means with. That's also where in English, the con beginning to a lot of words is going to mean with. Sometimes, and that beginning, that prefix will also be used in Latin. So like discipulus is a student. Condiscipuli would be my fellow students. So students with me. I didn't put a me in there, but condiscipuli would be fellow students. I was reading the breviary this morning, and today in the old calendar is the feast of St. Henry, who we celebrated in the new calendar a couple of days ago. Henry was the Holy Roman Emperor, and it mentions his wife, Cunegunda, as con sanctus, a saint with him, a fellow saint, because she was also canonized. They are both patrons of Germany. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, and so she was the Holy Roman Empress. Then in, not really in, but in and ad. Those are going to be our prepositions. So they're going to help point to things, but as we go through, you'll find you don't always need those. That using them or not using them is occasionally interchangeable in Latin because of what we're about to get into, which is declension. This is where we definitely descend into madness. So I'm going to clean the board here. I really should clean the board between. That red marker really marks this thing up. Actually, I think it's because the board is all scuffed, so it doesn't erase cleanly. Might need to put this board out to pasture. Take this board out behind the shed, put it out of its misery. We're writing a different color now. Yes?
Liz may be coming by in the next 15, 20 minutes to start setting up.
Okay, that's fine. I'll spend 15-ish minutes going over this, and then we will break, and you can do we'll pick up next time. All right. So in English, Spanish actually doesn't even do this. In English, the only time a noun, a word that is a person, place, or a thing, it changes is really to express possession, and in pretty much every language to express that it's plural. In Latin, the noun will change its form for 5 different grammatical cases. And the cases are the nominative, which, because it has that nom in there, it means name. That's going to be generally the subject of the sentence. The genitive, which is going to express usually possession. That will be translated as of. So aqua is water. Aquae, it's going to have our AE at the end, is of the water. The dative is going to express, let's see, of. Dative is going to express for, which, confusingly enough, is also aquae. How do you know the difference in a sentence? It depends on context. If you're reading a sentence that has aquae in it, then read through the sentence, translate it both ways, see which one makes more sense. The accusative is going to be the object of the sentence, the thing that receives the action of the verb. That's going to be aquam. And then the ablative. Now, this is just in the singular. We'll do the plural here in a second. Ablative is going to express position, usually translated as in, but it could also be on top of, or pretty much any of those position prepositions that tell you where a thing is at. Noe has more recently done this. Is that kind of a good way of expressing that? That's also going to be aqua. In the water, over the water, beneath the water, beside the water. This is called first declension. The way you tell something is first declension is you look at the genitive singular. If it ends in an AE, it's first declension. The declensions, there are several of them that have a different form that depend upon both the gender and the origin of a lot of the words. Most first declension, so a declension is just this set of endings, all right? It comes from the word decline. To inflect it like this is to decline the words. Now, again, we don't really do that in English because we use helping words to express all these things for the most part. Weirdly enough, we have a genitive case in English by attaching an apostrophe S to something. But we also, when we say of something, we're expressing the same thing. First declension nouns, many of them, most of them are feminine in gender. That's another thing we don't do in English, that if you've studied another language you're familiar with, is in English, gender is basically reflected by the 175 options that Facebook gives you. No, it's reflected by like what is the thing actually. So man is a masculine noun, and woman is a feminine noun, and chair is a neuter noun, because chairs don't have gender as far as I'm aware. I mean, it is 2022, and maybe the chair identifies as something, but so you never can tell with these chairs. I'm thinking a lot of other things right now, but I'm not going to go there because I'm being recorded and because I, don't want to lose my job. I'll get canceled. Yeah. In languages that are gendered, they are classified that way, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what the thing is. It's honestly just a way to kind of sort the words out. There is no like rhyme or reason to it. Like a good example is in Spanish, persona is a feminine, so it's la persona and not el persona. I don't know why person is a feminine word, it just is. It's one of those things that kind of makes sense in the sense of it's a good way to sort of divide up words. It also just doesn't actually make any intuitive sense in terms of the usage of it. There are some things that are going to obviously be masculine, obviously be feminine. A rex is a king, a regina is a queen. But other than that, like unless it is actually sort of a gendered reality, having gendered nouns doesn't really reflect anything in particular about reality.
But also, it's funny enough, in Latin, semiristas is
right.
Feminine.
Well, and that actually gets to this. So when I said most first declension are feminine, not all of them. Ones that are derived from Greek. Words in Latin that came from Greek end in an A, but they're masculine usually. And sometimes you have neuter words that end in an A. And again, that doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of the thing being talked about. Like again, going back to the word persona, which actually is Latin too, that could refer to a male person or a female person. But the word itself is considered feminine. Why that is, I don't know. Ask the people who invented language. When I was a kid, I used to have when I was probably like 3 years old, I had this idea that language was invented by people sitting around in kind of a smoke-filled room, inventing words for things. And like the concept would come up and they're like, okay, well, let's call that, and then they come up with a word for it. And I actually had this vision of these guys sitting around in dark suits inventing language, which is not. I'm assured that is not how it happened.
That was Adam's job.
Yeah. Yeah, and then somebody came along, and then the fall happened, and we have to decline our nouns. So, all right. Since there isn't just water, there's also waters, so we have to express things in the plural. Aquae is going to be our nominative plural, the waters. You might be familiar with that already because we do that sometimes with Latin words that have passed into English. We'll put an A at the end of them to pluralize them. Medical terminology that happens a lot. I'm trying to remember an example of that right off my head. I'm thinking more of second declension nouns as I do that because that's even easier to remember. If I think of one, I'll tell you. Aquarum, of the waters. That's the genitive plural.
Minutia? Is that the
Yeah, minutia is the singular. Minutiae with an E would be the plural. Yeah, good one. Extra points for Jordan.
0 plus 0 is still 0.
Exactly. It's like before we hired Tiffany and Rick was doing finance and Rick was a volunteer. I'd walk in every day and give Rick like a 4,000% raise. It's 4,000% of 0.
We're still waiting. Yeah.
No, he gets it. 4,000% of 0 is still 0. Aquis is going to be our dative. For those familiar with French or Spanish, hear that aqua is always pronounced with kind of that W in there. It's not going to be aquis or like equis, like dos equis. Or if you have two of them, it's a cuatro equis. On a bad week, I have a doce equis. 12 X's. If you have 12 X's, you might need doce equis. Aquis, excuse me. That's going to be the dative for the waters. Then aquas. That's going to be our accusative. That's the subject of the sentence. The waters, or the object of the sentence, that's what's being acted upon. And then aquis again. The way I always remembered this one when I was in school is as is. Is how you get the last part. The A and the RM you kind of have to learn, and then is as is. It's much easier to remember that way. You'll notice, though, so there are no articles in Latin. This right here is a complete of the water, but there is no the. You get into the Middle Ages, and some people will start using the particle that means that to mean the, and that's actually where it comes about in the Romance languages. So, like el and la in Spanish come from ile, ila, and ilud in Latin. But that's like a late medieval thing. I have a book on my shelf at home called Winnie Ile Pooh. Because technically it would just be Winnie Pooh, but that sounds really weird. So they did the Ile thing in there to make it sound, to more directly translate the title of the book. I also have Alicia in Terra Mirabili, Alice in Wonderland, and I'm terrified to read it because I'm terrified to read it in English. So how much more would it be if you could inflect all your nouns and things? Not only do so there are no articles, there is no a or the, which actually can make translating things a little bit difficult sometimes because it's not clear whether you're talking about, so especially if you have what's called a substantive adjective. So you have an adjective, but it acts as a verb in the sentence. You know how when we say the Our Father in English, we say deliver us from evil, and that's kind of a nebulous term, like from evil. It's like, well, it's sort of this like evil in general, bad stuff. In Greek, it says because Greek does have articles, it says the evil one. It says the evil. And so the evil is not a concept, it's a thing. And it really could be translated as the evil one. Substantives will come up a lot in Latin, but you have to kind of figure it out from the context. Particularly if you end up with a sentence where the object of the sentence is a verb or is an adjective and not a noun, then it's actually functioning as a noun. In addition to declining our nouns, we have to decline the adjectives that go with them. They have to agree. That's one of the reasons word order is not terribly important in Latin. And that's why Latin poetry, they will move things around. So you might be talking about the good water, which is the example that we have in the book. And you could separate those two words if it would help sort of the rhythm or the cadence of what you're writing, even though that would refer them back to that. That's very important in interpreting documents. There's one very infamous example of a church document that was translated incorrectly into English. That is the reason why it's thought that you can't say Mass facing the altar and not the people, because it says desirable wherever possible, which in English modifies the next closest thing, which is the altar or celebration facing the people as possible. Celebration facing the people. It says which is desirable wherever possible. But if you look in Latin at the endings, the ending for that collection of words actually points to the altar is built apart from the wall and not celebration facing the people. So that's how, like, it's very important in interpreting things to, especially if there's a separation between descriptors, to see where, like how they agree. Yeah, that's a totally different thing. So good is bonus if it's a masculine word, but bona if it's feminine. So then we're going to have aqua bona, aquae bonae, I overpronounced that, of the good waters, aquae bonae, for the good waters, aquam bonam, the good waters as the object of the sentence, the thing being acted upon. I saw the good waters. Yeah, that's right. Vidi aquam bonam. Vidi aquam is actually a hymn that is sung at Easter. You know how I say it's not Easter until Randy sings I Saw Water Flowing? That's the Vidi aquam. That's a 7th century hymn for the sprinkling of water at Easter. And then in the good waters, aqua bona. And sometimes you'll see that with in front of it, and sometimes you won't. And if you don't, you have to use the context. Our book is very good about not making it not requiring a ton of detective work to figure out what's being said early on. But after about chapter 10, God help you. Aquae bone, the good waters, as the subject of the sentence, the nominative. And the thing is, like I said, we do this in modern languages. We mostly do it with like our pronoun usage and stuff. That was actually when I was in Spanish immersion, I actually asked, is it appropriate to say that these are the grammatical cases as they're explaining to and te and all that? And the teacher said, that's technically correct, but that's just not how that's taught. I was like, that's unfortunate, because if you can kind of master what these things kind of mean, it gets so much easier than to classify things this way. But anyway, so aquae bone, aquarum bonarum, of the good waters. Like I say, they have to agree. Aquis bonis, for the good waters. Aquas bonas, object of the sentence. And aquis bonis, in the good waters. I jump in the good waters. Salto aquis bonis. All right. So, I think we'll break there. If you want to take a look, how we'll do this is go ahead and take a look at the exercises, the first section, because there's two units of exercises in the chapter. I forget what they call them actually. Does it say units? Yeah. Go ahead and look at the Unit 1 exercises, and we will start by going over those next time. Also, by next time, I'll probably have some additional handouts, resources, and things. On the back of your prayer sheet, there is a web address for Preces Latine, which is a website. It's been around for a very long time. I remember finding it when I was in high school. And there are a lot of Latin prayers and things on there. They're the ones you're going to be more familiar with. There's some others that are not quite as familiar, but go check that out. It's a good way to kind of, again, familiarize yourself. I would say, too, look up biblical passages, and I'll hand out some things like that. If there's biblical passages, there's a lot of stuff that we're just kind of familiar with from casual contact. I'll also, Preces Latine has booklets for the rosary and for the Mass. And again, looking at things you're familiar with already and then reading them in the other language is a great way to acquire it. The first book I buy when I try to learn a new language is the Bible. So you can come to my house and see how many of those I've attempted. I've not been successful at most of them, but it helps to look at things you're already familiar with. There are children's books in Latin. You can get Winnie ile Pooh. You can get Alicia in Terra Mirabili. You can get what's that? Catus in Petastatus. Yeah, you can get Cat in the Hat. You can get. I had Green Eggs and Ham at one point, and I gave it to somebody. You can get like pretty much all the Dr. Seuss books.
Tom Sawyer in Latin as well.
Tom Sawyer. I've got the Little Prince in Latin. I also have it in Koine Greek. You can get I forget how many of the Harry Potter books they've done into Latin. There's only 2 of them in Greek a couple of years ago, and I think they've done like 3 or 4 of them into Latin. I would go with something else, quite honestly, but I would stick with Winnie ile Pooh, especially because of how they translate the poetry in it. There's actually been tons of articles written on Winnie ile Pooh as an example of why something like that is important. Like, it sounds a little bit ridiculous to take a children's book and translate it into a dead language, but there have been a lot of scholars who have looked at this and like, this is actually a great way to kind of look at the synthesis of ancient languages and kind of keeping them alive and things like that. So it's actually my great uncle, who was a priest, would send me books, and he sent me that when I told him I was learning Latin in college. He sent me a couple of Latin books, including that one. And inside, whenever he read like a magazine or newspaper article about a book in particular or about something covered by the book, he would clip the article and like fold it up and put it under the dust jacket. So my copy of Winnie ile Pooh has the article that he clipped out about they had interviewed the translator. But it's still in print. I've got 2 copies of it that are both from like the 50s when it came out. But you can still buy a brand new copy of it. So, all right, we will conclude then with one of our prayers. We will conclude with a glory be, the doxology. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.